G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. It has been a big start to the Trump administration, a flurry of extremely aggressive and proactive executive orders. It's kind of head-spinning and it's a little difficult to understand and to contextualize. So I thought that I would try to assist by identifying ways, one specific way in fact, in which the legacy media could be doing a better job of helping us to understand the context of what's happening and helping us to have uncomfortable conversations instead of sitting comfortably in our pre-existing interpretation and expectations of who Trump is and what he's up to. My worry is that the coverage of Trump's initial flurry of actions makes it more difficult. The coverage by the legacy media, that is, and by Podcastistan, in fact, makes it more difficult to understand what's really going on. And in the case of the legacy media, that is partly caused because on a few central issues, journalism and newsrooms have been captured by interest groups, activist groups. And I want to look in particular at the coverage of Trump's policies on trans people and biological sex as a case study of how damaging it can be to a healthy national conversation when journalists do activism and when you start assigning stories and beats to people on the basis of their identity and their activist interest, rather than on their ability to integrate information across a wide range of different interests in a way that will resonate with people who don't have a pre-existing preconception about that particular identity group or activist cause. Because what's happened is that some of the coverage on hot button social justice issues and sensitive issues has understandably in recent years been assigned to people who have a particular interest in that. So LGBT issues will be covered by LGBT people and race issues will be covered by racial minorities. It's an understandable instinct, but it can also actually make it harder for the average citizen to understand these issues because they're only hearing about them through a particular lens that seems, frankly, alien to the mainstream. Even if you oppose Trump and what Trump is doing, I think this sort of coverage makes it harder to oppose him because it's harder to understand what he's actually doing, what he thinks he's doing, and what his supporters are supporting him to do. And it makes it harder to argue against it in a coherent way that will persuade anyone who isn't already on your side. So let's take a look at what Trump did and then how it's covered in the legacy media and how a healthy conversation might want to cover it instead. I'm going to focus specifically on the main headline about Trump's gender policies in the main national public broadcaster in Australia, the ABC, a cherished institution and one that does a lot of great work. But on this particular issue, as its own ombudsman at Media Watch, the television show, has covered several times, on this particular issue, there is a really harmful capture of the news division by ideologues. The headline on the main page, one of the most read articles of the week, is entitled, quote, "Cruel and Inhuman, Queer Community Reacts to Trump's Order on Gender." That's the clickbait, and when you click through, the headline says, "Donald Trump's executive order on gender is quote unquote cruel, US queer community says." I should add, this is not a follow-up addendum to a larger piece that explains what the executive order is and speaks to people who defend it. This is the piece. This is the coverage. So the man who won a majority of votes in the United States is implementing a broadly popular policy about biological sex. And the only coverage that we're getting from the national broadcaster is not, and I'm not saying that this is a good thing. I'm just saying if you want to understand the world around you, you're going to have to hear, presumably, from people who understand and can articulate the rationale behind the policies that you disagree with. But the main article about this is the first words of the link that you click on are cruel and inhuman. And then you click through and it says, again, that it's cruel, according to the US queer community. Let me quote. The article begins, President Donald Trump's decision to recognize only two sexes, male and female, has sparked growing concern and confusion among the LGBTQIA+ community in the United States. Mr. Trump signed an executive order recognizing only male and female sexes, the article says, and declaring they cannot be changed shortly after being sworn in as president. He also revoked orders from the Biden administration aimed at preventing discrimination based on gender identity or sexual discrimination. And just this week, the article goes on, he signed an executive order to end federal funding for gender-affirming care for children under 19 across the US. Okay. Let's just note immediately, right off the bat, before we even get into this lengthy piece, that it is using language of the activist gender community already. And again, I'm not having a go at where people's hearts are on this, or whether or not it is legitimate to criticize a policy that I personally regard as muddle-headed and harsh and uncaring. Whether or not that policy would have been brought into existence were it not for the overreach of gender and queer activists in the first place is a conversation we can have later. But the policy in and of itself, like much that Donald Trump does, is too brutal and too blunt. But set that aside for a moment. This is a news organization, and this is an article that is not an opinion piece. It is supposed to inform the Australian public about what the President of the United States is doing. And the charter of the National Public Broadcaster is that it will speak to all Australians and reflect the diversity of the Australian community. And that word diversity has become interpreted to mean that we will cherry pick individuals from minority groups to articulate the most extreme activist positions on those issues and smuggle it in as if it was objective news. Instead of what I regard diversity, what I think diversity should mean, and what I think the average person in the street commonsensically understands diversity to mean, which is we will reflect the full range of viewpoints, of valid viewpoints that are expressed by the Australian community, including potentially ones that the social justice, university-educated elite might find distasteful. So already at the beginning of this article, which again is entitled Cruel and Inhuman, Queer Community Reacts to Trump's Order on Gender, already in the first few paragraphs, just teeing up what's happened, it says that Trump signed an executive order to end federal funding for gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care used to be called gender transition care or gender transition operations. Before that, it was called sex change operations, or, it may not be an operation, but sex change healthcare. Affirming was a rhetorical and linguistic switch that the trans community pushed for, because it was a way of saying, we're not transitioning the gender, we are rather affirming the gender that actually the person is underneath their skin and has been all along. So if a 12-year-old girl on the autism spectrum who has no friends and suffers from anxiety and depression and exists inside a social clique where several of her friends are transitioning, especially if she comes from a fairly homophobic environment where there is a social penalty for coming out as a butch lesbian, if she wants to declare that she is now a he, then the medical assistance that she or he or they might receive used to be called gender transition. Now it's called gender affirmation, because you're affirming the fact that this girl is actually a male deep inside. Now, there may be very good reasons for going along with that, but it is not the place of an objective news article in the National Public Broadcaster to be putting its thumb on the scale in the very first few paragraphs, trying to explain to people, to help them understand what a new American administration is doing by calling it gender-affirming care. Frankly, I would use more neutral language, even though I know that's not the formal policy, because a lot of these news organizations have transitioned, pardon the pun, transitioned. They've been affirmed in recent years from using more colloquial language into using activist language in order to get scored well by activist LGBT groups, which go around pronouncing whether or not particular organizations are sufficiently friendly to queer people. And you have to sort of implement the changes that they want you to, and in my opinion, contaminate journalistic integrity by following a particular script that may or may not be confusing or may not be enlightening to the readers in order to get a good score amongst the activist class. So let's just continue here. There's then a subtitle, a subheading in the article that says, "What is the executive order on gender?" And I think to myself, oh, goody, we're going to get some facts here. The article says, "The order declares there are only two sexes, male and female." It says, "It defines the sexes in an unconventional way based on the reproductive cells, large cells in females or small ones in males. The order also suggests that humans have those cells at conception, rejecting that people can transition from one gender to another or be considered anything other than male or female. This essentially means," the article says, "people who identify as non-binary aren't considered anymore." Okay, this is not well written. What does it mean to say that people who identify as non-binary aren't considered anymore? Aren't considered for what? Aren't considered by whom? Does it mean they're not allowed to exist? Does it mean that it's against the law to call yourself non-binary? No, it doesn't mean any of that. Aren't considered. I mean, that's appalling. That's such appalling writing and should have been edited. But let's just start from the top. The order declares that there are only two sexes, male and female. It defines the sexes in an unconventional way. I mean, that's an extraordinary claim. It defines the sexes in an unconventional way based on the reproductive cells. It is unconventional to define the sexes based on reproductive cells because 3 seconds ago, in historical and cultural time, everyone was bullied by activists into sort of pretending that biology isn't what it is. Again, this is not at all to say that trans people shouldn't have every right, or anyone should have every right to identify however they want to. But if we're talking about biology, which this article now is, it's making a claim that it is unconventional to assert that the sexes are defined by reproductive cells. I mean, this is one of the most basic principles of all, not just human life, not just mammalian life, not just animal life, but life on Earth. I mean, the way in which evolution produces genetic variance is by having one half of a population of a species of one category and another of another. And yes, there'll be minorities in between who are, differently functioning in some way. There'll be intersex individuals and so on. But the vast majority of individual living creatures fall on one side of a binary. There are very few things in nature that are binary. Most things are shades of grey. Sexuality is clearly shades of grey. Night and day are shades of grey. Wetness and dryness are shades of grey. Sex really is one of those rare things in nature where there are chromosomal toggles where it's an on switch or an off switch. There's an XX or an XY. There are types of animals that have large stationary reproductive cells, like female eggs, and then the other half will have small mobile reproductive cells, like sperm. And again, this is not to say that people with small mobile reproductive cells can't feel like they're women and dress as women, and that they shouldn't be accorded all of the rights to define themselves however they want to. And it's not to say that some people are XXY or XYY or intersex or have unusual gametes or have, both types of reproductive parts. That all exists. But it is wild for the most credible and august and respected news organization in the country to write a sentence like, the Trump order defines the sexes in an unconventional way. This has been a basic principle of science, biology, and culture for, thousands of years culturally and centuries scientifically. And then in the past decade or so, we've changed our minds about this and said that because people who don't fit the binary are deserving of respect and have been traditionally disenfranchised and abused and victims of hate crime, we should all be a lot nicer towards them. And the way in which we should be a lot nicer to them is by pretending that what has been very, very conventional in our understanding of biology is now, as the ABC News website puts it, unconventional. The article, as I just read, goes on to say, the order also suggests that humans have those cells at conception. Well, so at conception, you obviously don't have your sex cells fully fledged, but it is not the case that cells at conception do not have sex. Remember, we're talking about biological sex here. We're not talking about gender. We're not talking about how the blastocyst feels inside, whether it wants to play with dolls or whether it wants to play with trucks. We're talking about whether or not the blastocyst whether or not there is predictive power in, can you take a biopsy of a 5-day-old blastocyst and with near certainty figure out whether or not that is going to be a male of the species or a female of the species when it is born? Of course you can. I did it with my children before they were born. When they were 5-day-old blastocysts, they were biopsied to check for genetic diseases because we were using IVF, and that was something that we could avail ourselves of in the United States just to make sure that they were okay. And as part of that, their sex was listed on the sheet. Again, does that mean that it's inevitable that they will not be trans and that they will be cis? Of course not. But this article is making it sound like it's a bizarre, unscientific thing for the Trump administration to issue an executive order that suggests that humans can be male or female at the moment of conception. It says that it rejects that people can transition from one gender to another or be considered anything other than male or female. This is another point of very poor writing and poor thinking, which serves Australians very poorly in helping to understand this issue. There is an evasion throughout this article and throughout so much of the coverage from the progressive legacy media of the difference between sex and gender. The article says the order declares there are only two sexes. Then it says it defines the sexes in an unconventional way. Now, I'm not sure if the journalists writing this are even aware of the fact that they're conflating biological sex with the cultural notion of gender, or if they're doing it intentionally. It's quite possible that they're just so imbued in the activist circles that they're not even aware that there's a difference. But they transition from saying there are only two sexes and it defines the sexes in an unconventional way. It doesn't define the sexes in an unconventional way. It might define gender in an unconventional way by suggesting that gender is innate at the moment of conception, but that's a perfectly conventional understanding of biological sex, and the vast majority of scientists would agree with that, and the vast majority of cultures around the world would agree with it, except for socially progressive social justice activists in Western countries in the past 5 or 10 years. But then you'll notice that the word gets changed from sex to gender in the following paragraph. The order also suggests that humans have those cells at conception, rejecting that people can transition from one gender to another. Rejecting that people can transition from one gender to another. Well, hang on, that's a bit of a bait and switch. Is that a little magic trick? We've just quietly dispensed with the word sex, and we've introduced the word gender. It says, so it is a different claim to say that people can transition from one gender to another than to say that people can transition from one sex to another. And then we get to the sentence that says this essentially means people who identify as non-binary aren't considered anymore. The article then goes on to articulate perhaps what it means by that claim that it's unconventional to interpret sex as being binary and that humans don't really have sex cells at conception. It says, the position conflicts with what the American Medical Association and other mainstream medical groups say, that extensive scientific research suggests sex and gender are better understood as a spectrum. Now, I know that mainstream medical associations have been co-opted and sort of browbeaten into making claims. Look, a lot of this is very worthy and very worthwhile, which is why I know that I'll get a lot of shit for saying all this stuff. I don't mean to diminish or demean the importance of understanding the risks that exist for the trans community and for genderqueer people. Like, a lot of the time in the past 5 or 10 years, I think very well-meaning people in places like the American Medical Association and the Australian Medical Association have felt that it is a noble lie to talk about sex being non-binary because the medical hazard of abuse and injustice and persecution against trans people is sufficiently severe that anything we can do to give a scientific imprimatur on sort of progressive causes that will elevate the safety of trans people is worth it. It might be a little bit, I suspect, like the claim during COVID that anti-racist protests in 2020 are okay even if they transmit coronavirus because the risk of racist violence is greater than the risk of the virus itself. Might be sort of this assumption that the risk of anti-trans hate acts is worse than the risk of a little white lie about the nature of biological sex as a spectrum rather than as a binary. Now, I would quibble even with that claim because I think that lying or misleading or equivocating about the nature of scientific fact actually in the long run is more harmful to trans people because you end up with reactionary movements like the Trump movement. You end up with executive orders like this one, which in large part I don't think would have the fuel behind them if there wasn't a general sense of the public being fed up with nonsense on the left. It's a self-reinforcing ratcheting up of extremism on both sides. But set that aside for the moment. I got curious about what the American Medical Association actually said because I thought, that sounds odd. I would be absolutely certain that the AMA claims that gender is a spectrum. But I'd be surprised if even the AMA had gone so far as to say that sex was a spectrum, and I'd be even more surprised if they claimed that there was extensive scientific research, which this article, again, a news article, not an opinion article, a news article, a supposedly objective news article, is stating that the American Medical Association and other mainstream medical groups say that extensive scientific research suggests sex, not just gender, is better understood as a spectrum. So I went to ChatGPT, which I'm a premium user of and I use a lot. And I've been using it an enormous amount over the past 6 months. And I have never received an error message that says, something seems to have gone wrong. But I typed into ChatGPT. Don't worry, I don't regard it as flawless. I always follow up with some other investigation. But as an initial insight, it's usually reasonably good. And I asked it, does the American Medical Association say that extensive scientific research suggests sex and gender are better understood as a spectrum? And ChatGPT said, something seems to have gone wrong. And I said, try again. And it said, something seems to have gone wrong. And I said, are you not permitted to discuss this? And it said, something seems to have gone wrong. So good on the coders of ChatGPT for not allowing it to wade into that territory. Forgive me for being suspicious, but I think they're probably wise to try to avoid the social media hounding that they would get if they accidentally told the truth about this. So I went to the AMA's website and I looked up their actual policy. The policy headline says, affirming the medical spectrum of gender. It doesn't say affirming the medical spectrum of gender and sex. But it does say, this is their announcement about a change in policy on gender and sex from a few years ago. The AMA will oppose efforts to deny an individual's right to determine their stated sex marker or gender identity. The new policy comes just weeks after a memo circulated within the Trump administration. This is Trump 1.0. I believe this policy change came in 2017 in response to Trump's first term. The new policy comes after a memo circulated in the administration proposed narrowly defining sex as a person's status as male or female based on immutable biological traits identifiable by or before birth. So this was Trump's first bite at the apple. The first time around, he tried to do this. And the AMA board member who's quoted here says, sex and gender are more complex than previously assumed. It is essential to acknowledge that an individual's gender identity may not align with the sex assigned to them at birth. And this board member goes on to say, a narrow limit on the definition of sex would have public health consequences for the transgender population and individuals born with differences in sexual differentiation, also known as intersex traits. Then it says the AMA will work to preserve access to quality healthcare by educating state and federal policymakers to ensure they have a fundamental understanding of the scientific nature of a person's sex. That reads to me like the AMA doing what I articulated before, which is sensing that it's important for them not to take a stand on sex, but it's important for them to be seen to be on the side of transgender people because they don't want to be condoning the brutalization of a traditionally disenfranchised minority group. That does not sound to me like what the ABC news article claims, which is that the American Medical Association and mainstream medical groups say that extensive scientific research suggests that sex and gender are better understood as a spectrum. I can't find any evidence of the American Medical Association or mainstream medical groups publishing extensive scientific research that suggests that biological sex is a spectrum. The article goes on to say, Mr. Trump's order also stated it aimed to protect women's spaces from those who, quote unquote, self-identify as women. The bulk of the rest of the article is interviews with gender non-binary and genderqueer people in the United States who are basically expressing their fears and saying that they're concerned. One of them is Sarah Kate Smigel, who identifies as non-binary and queer, and the journalists have obviously reached out to her. She's a content creator, so they presumably follow her on Instagram, and they've hit her up and interviewed her. Now, I should say they, I assume, because if they're non-binary, then they probably go by a they. Now, this person there's a photo, looks very much like a female, okay, but they identify as non-binary and queer, and they are quoted as saying the following, quote, I need to be careful not to get pulled over. I still have F for female on my driver's license. So if they saw that, meaning the police, and a government official doesn't believe I fit into that category, my license can be taken away as well, they said. Well, I don't want to diminish people's fear, but firstly, there's nothing in the executive order that says that your license can be taken away or that an existing piece of government documentation can be taken away from you if it was lawfully issued because it is different from your biological gender. And secondly, this is a person who presents as female, was presumably born as female, although I'm guessing, but they look female and their name is Sarah Kate, and their license says that they're female. So unless they start picking a fight with a government official by insisting that they're not female and that they want to be called non-binary, even though it says female on their license, I don't understand what this fear is from. And then this person is quoted as saying, the article says, Sarah Kate said some people have had their documentation confiscated because of the X marker. The X marker was introduced some years ago during the Biden administration, I believe, in a capitulation to trans activists, where now you can have an American passport or driver's license that is not male or female, but X, which is sort of neither. And Sarah Kate says some people have had their documentation confiscated. Now, the journalists don't seem to have done any follow-up on that. There's no paragraph about how they have asked law enforcement in the United States whether or not people are having their documents confiscated. There's no paragraph about how they followed up with an LGBT activist group to ask whether or not they could put them in touch with anyone who has had their passport or driver's license confiscated because of the X marker. There's no follow-up paragraph about anyone who they've spoken to, who they've found online or on social media, who claims to have their document confiscated. Again, this is a news article in the national public broadcaster, and it is reporting hearsay with no follow-up from someone who has a vested interest in presenting a certain angle on the president's actions. And there is no questioning of this claim that this person is saying, making quite a serious allegation. It would be quite serious if within the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration, police and government officials were confiscating the passports or the driver's licenses of people that were lawfully issued to people because they had, the wrong gender. That would be unconstitutional and that would be a crime. That would surely be against the 14th Amendment for equal protection, because you're not treating the person with the X on their passport the same way that you treat a male or a female. I mean, that would be thrown out by the courts. So there's an allegation just thrown out there in a news article with no follow-up and no verification. Sarah Kate just said it, so it gets reported. Another person whose experiences are quoted in this article is a Canadian author and advocate, Gemma Hickey, who flew to Seattle, Washington a few days after the executive order on gender was signed. This is in a section of the article about what the impact might be on foreigners like Australians who travel to the United States. And there's a photo of Gemma, and Gemma has a beard. Gemma presents as traditionally male, a large, impressive beard. It doesn't say anything, understandably, about what the sort of biological background of Gemma's experience is, but it does say that Gemma said that they were asked more questions than normal at the airport, including questions around their name in comparison to how they looked, by the American airline. They described this process as, quote, a mini interrogation, and said, quote, these microaggressions were real. Okay. There's a tell in that description, which is that it was the airline that was doing this, not the State Department or US Customs and Border Enforcement at the airport. The airline's job is not to enforce the Trump administration's rules about gender. Those rules apply to federal government employees and federal agencies only. They cannot apply beyond the purview of the United States federal government. You can't compel a private company to enforce some kind of gender policy that it disagrees with. It has the right under the First Amendment to say whatever it wants to about gender, and and its employees have the right to do so as well. So there's an airline whose job it is, when they're checking you in for an international flight, to make sure that you're the person who you say you are. This is a security issue. This is a counterterrorism issue. If you show up to board a plane and you hand them a passport where your name is Gemma and you have a beard, it is understandable that they would want to verify that you're the person who booked the ticket and you're the person whose passport they're looking at. Is it worse now? Does this kind of executive order create a climate of suspicion? Does it give a sort of a pass to people who might be mini Nazis who want to interrogate everyone and throw their weight around? I'm sure it does. I'm sure it's no fun walking through the world presenting as a sex that is different from the one that's on your ID. I'm sure that is incredibly annoying and frustrating. And it may be the case that it becomes more annoying and frustrating as a result of this order. But to say that it's a mini interrogation or that there's something illegitimate about it, or even to link it back formally to this executive order, is sloppy journalism. What was the airline? What was the context of this so-called mini interrogation? The article goes on to say, Gemma said their delayed plane meant they were put up in a Vancouver hotel overnight, but when they arrived at the airport the next day, there were also issues. Quote, it seemed like the same sort of thing, another mini interrogation, more photographs, and then I was asked to say my name out loud. He did a double take of me and my ID because I look masculine. Then he asked me to scan my passport, and this is the first time this ever happened, but my passport did not read, did not scan. I never had that problem before. How does the passport scanner magically know that you look male? Gemma said they were eventually let on the flight, and the agent said, well, you can go on, sir, or whatever. There was just this lack of disregard for my identity, and people were really rude. Okay. It should be noted that the article ends before we get to a single quote from a single person who is interviewed about why this is taking place, about why there is support for this executive order. There is no quoting from the order itself. So I think perhaps we should do so. Here's the executive order. Presidential actions, whitehouse.gov. Defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. Executive order. Section 1, purpose. Across the country, ideologues who deny the biological reality of sex have increasingly used legal and other socially coercive means to permit men to self-identify as women and gain access to intimate single-sex spaces and activities designed for women, from women's domestic abuse shelters to women's workplace showers. I'm skipping ahead a little. This unhealthy road, it continues, is paved by an ongoing and purposeful attack against the ordinary and long-standing use and understanding of biological and scientific terms, replacing the immutable biological reality of sex with an internal, fluid, and subjective sense of self unmoored from biological facts. The White House order continues, invalidating the true and biological category of woman improperly transforms laws and policies designed to protect sex-based opportunities into laws and policies that undermine them, replacing long-standing cherished legal rights and values with an identity-based, inchoate social concept. Accordingly, it goes on to list the five basic things that it wants to happen in this executive order. A, sex shall refer to an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. Sex is not a synonym for and does not include the concept of gender identity. B, women or woman and girls or girl shall mean adult and juvenile human females, respectively. C, men or man and boys or boy shall mean adult and juvenile human males, respectively. D, female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. E, male means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. And then it basically goes on to say the contexts in which it wants this to be upheld. It's basically saying that when you're writing an official, if you work for the federal government and you're writing an official federal document, then you should use the term sex in the way that it's prescribed, and you should use the word gender in the way it's described. You should not use the word gender as a synonym for sex in applicable federal policies and documents. And then it says that government-issued identification documents like passports, visas, and global entry cards should reflect the holder's sex, and that agencies will remove all statements, policies, regulations, forms, communications that inculcate gender ideology and confuse sex with gender. Now, that may all be overkill. It may be brutalizing to a minority community. It may be harsh. It may be uncaring. It may open the door to more prejudice. And all of that would be a very interesting thing for the national public broadcaster, the most trusted news site, newsroom in Australia, to grapple with. It would be interesting to hear people who defend that, to hear from activists who can address those real concerns about why we should be conflating, who can argue for why we should be conflating sex with gender. And the principal article that is written describing this policy change in the United States to an Australian audience should really be just the facts, ma'am. It should be down the straight and narrow. It should not begin by using activist language like sex affirmation care. It should not go on to then claim that the executive order is unconventional and controversial scientifically in ways that it's really not. It should not mislead people about the position of mainstream medical establishments and the American Medical Association by conflating sex and gender and claiming that those establishments say that sex is a spectrum when really their focus is about how gender is a spectrum, and they merely nod to sex as an inclusion in order to ensure that trans people are not discriminated against. It should provide, in other words, context, and it should speak in a way that people who aren't inside this debate, who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid on one side or another, can understand and can appreciate. Again, if you want to defeat ideas, you need to understand them from the perspective of the people who advocate them, not just from the people who hate them. You know, if you don't understand your opponent's position, then you don't understand your own. And the article certainly shouldn't then go on to simply cherry pick a few social media content creators who these journalists follow, presumably, and ask them for anecdotes about how afraid they feel on the basis of third-hand hearsay about what may or may not have happened to other people that the journalists then don't follow up. They don't follow up with the airline that supposedly interrogated Gemma. They don't presumably follow up with anyone who Sarah has heard from, who has had their documentation confiscated. And if they did follow up and they found nothing, then say that. There's a bigger issue here. It has to do with our understanding of diversity in newsrooms. I don't blame these journalists. I don't think they know what they don't know. We can't know what we don't know. We increasingly live in an information ecosystem where we inhabit echo chambers. If I had to bet, I would assume that these journalists are in their 20s or 30s. I would assume that they're very online. I would assume that they are members of the LGBTQIA+ community, that they may be genderqueer themselves, and that they consume a lot of content on Instagram Reels from that community. If I'm wrong, I'll be really surprised and very impressed that they're not from that community, and also baffled about how they could write an article with such glaring blind spots. Because the way we've conceived of diversity in newsrooms is mistaken. Diversity is terrific when it can provide fresh perspectives on issues. And you get that when you assign stories to minority journalists, to a diverse community of reporters, which they have no specific expertise in, and which they need to come to with a fresh lens. I'm all in favor of making newsrooms less white, stale, middle-aged, male, straight, and cis. There should be a diversity of backgrounds, but there should also be a diversity of political opinions, and there should also be a diversity of economic backgrounds. There should also be a diversity of class, and there should also be a diversity of people who come from outside the social justice activist bubble. And then you should assign stories to those people almost at random. You should have the queer person of color covering a corporate story just as much as you have them covering a racial or a gender story. Because the trouble we're running into here, I suppose, can be summarized as the problem of the Own Voices thesis. Own Voices is a movement that says that we should empower the voices from inside a community by not speaking on their behalf. You might be familiar with this in the sense that gay actors should play gay roles. You shouldn't have straight people playing those roles. You should have, a Latino character should be played by a Latino. You shouldn't have a Filipino, trying to pass as a Latino in a movie. Trans people should play trans people. And you shouldn't, for example, write a novel from the perspective of, what was that novel, An American Dirt, I think, a great novel about the plight of a Mexican refugee family, I believe, but it turned out that it was written by someone who is not a Mexican, and they got into all kinds of hot water. The idea is that we should be empowering people's own voices rather than permitting people to comment on or inhabit the identity of communities to which they don't belong. When you do that in a newsroom, what it means is that only members from a specific community are regarded as having standing to discuss issues relevant to that community. This leads to a lack of diversity because each echo chamber is just reciting the slogans and catechisms and cherished beliefs of its own group. We need to fundamentally reassess whether it's true that members of a group are best equipped to report on that group. By all means, hire young, genderqueer, very online reporters if they're good at writing, if they're interested in things, if they have an expansive view of the world, if they're deeply curious, if they're articulate, if they're a bit cheeky, if they're contrarian, if they have a questioning mind. And then assign them stories from all over the map and allow their curiosity to probe where it will. Do not hire them to cover stories where you could jot on the back of a napkin before they even start writing it what the perspective and slant of that story is going to be, and then expect to retain your audience as the national public broadcaster whose charter insists that it must speak on behalf of all Australians. Because you're not doing that anymore. You're preaching to bubbles. I mean, think about it this way. Is it really that different to assign all LGBT reporting to people in the LGBT community than to assign all reporting on the mining industry to people in the mining industry? You would immediately recognize that that's a conflict of interest. It's not true that people from the mining industry are necessarily best equipped to report on the mining industry. Like, you want to have some basic level of understanding about industry, but you also want people who are free from any hang-ups and any biases, who don't necessarily have any skin in the game, to interrogate properly as good investigative journalists. And that piece that I've just read out portions of is an appalling piece of reporting. It is a perfectly adequate piece of activism and an appalling piece of reporting and a non-existent piece of investigative journalism. It leaves nobody any wiser about what Trump is doing, why he's doing it, why he has support for doing it, and what the contours of the debate are for Americans who oppose what he's doing. It's just fear-mongering and generalizing with the very broadest of brushstrokes. I'm out of time for this rant. Otherwise, I would also get to coverage of Facebook's change about free speech, which I don't have time to do properly, but allow me to read the way that the Australian public broadcaster reported on Meta's change when Mark Zuckerberg said that it would no longer be so aggressive about policing hate speech, or rather it would have a more limited definition of what hate speech is. This is what it said, what the ABC released on Instagram. Meta will allow LGBTQ plus people to be described as quote-unquote mentally ill and women as quote-unquote household objects. Scroll to the next tile in the carousel. Changes to Meta's hateful conduct policy could lead to increased hate speech and real-world safety concerns, according to a Queensland social media expert. Social media giant Meta will now allow allegations of mental illness or abnormality based on gender or sexual orientation on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. And then in bold, it also will now allow women to be referred to as household objects, and for content arguing in favor of gender-based limitations of military, law enforcement, and teaching jobs. Then the third page in the carousel gives a quick quote of a statement from Meta. The fourth page in the carousel quotes a social media researcher at the Queensland University of Technology who says marginalised people, like those in the LGBTQ plus community, need more protection, not less. Then the fifth page in the carousel is a picture of a transgender woman. And it says, transgender woman Chelsea Morrigan said they were not surprised by the changes which come after the removal of multiple LGBTQ plus Facebook groups that were flagged as at risk for cybersecurity breaches and a regional Queensland group being completely removed from the platform last year. Meta released a statement saying a technical error was to blame. I don't know what that has to do with this global change. And then the last tile in the carousel says, growing up in regional Queensland, the local Rockhampton artist said they had received multiple death threats both in person and online related to their gender and identity, which left them fearing for their safety. I've read the changes to Meta's hate speech policy, and death threats online are absolutely still forbidden on Meta. So I don't know what relevance that necessarily has. It's basically a hodgepodge of activist worries and feelings. It's not really news. I'm sorry, it's not. It's not even news analysis, because good news analysis would articulate the position of Facebook, of Meta, which is a free speech position. Nowhere in this sort of Gen Z screed against Meta is there a hint that by implementing these changes, it does not mean that Meta is endorsing those opinions. There is nowhere a kind of a Voltairean understanding of, I detest what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. There's no suggestion when they write things about how women can be described as household objects or gay people can be described as being mentally ill, that there might be a deeper, broader defense of free speech that does not condone those specific claims, but simply takes a neutral stance and says that in the grand landscape of human opinion, it's important for people to be able to flesh out ideas in ways that other people might find offensive. So it even fails the decent, smart analysis test. Anyway, I hope that case study is in some way constructive. I will have more to say about this. I hope you have a fabulous weekend. Hang in there. Trump is throwing a lot at us, and it's important for us to be diligent in the way that we think about how we interpret them and how we maintain our capacity to have uncomfortable conversations.